A name was spoken on stage. Morgan Freeman froze. His eyes filled with tears. And without saying a word, he stood up and walked away. October 17, 2019. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. Studios 6A at Rockefeller Center. Thursday night taping. The audience was buzzing with excitement because Morgan Freeman, one of the most respected actors in Hollywood, the voice that narrated documentaries and gave gravitas to every film he touched, was scheduled as the main guest. Jimmy walked out to thunderous applause. The monologue went smoothly. Jokes about the news, a bit about his daughters, the usual Tonight Show energy that millions of Americans had come to love. The Roots played him into commercial breaks. Everything was routine. Coming up after the break, Jimmy told the cameras with his signature grin, "The legendary Morgan Freeman is here!" The audience erupted. Morgan Freeman rarely did talk shows. When he did, it was an event. During the commercial break, Jimmy shuffled his blue note cards at his desk, glancing over the questions his writers had prepared. Standard stuff, new movie, career reflections, maybe a funny story from set. Safe. Professional. Easy. What Jimmy didn't know was that one of those note cards contained a question that would change everything. The show came back from commercial. The Roots played the intro music. Jimmy stood up. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the incomparable Morgan Freeman." Morgan walked out from backstage. 72 years old but moving with the dignity of someone who had commanded screens for 5 decades. Gray suit. Perfectly tailored. That familiar slight smile. He shook Jimmy's hand, waved to the audience, and settled into the guest chair with practiced ease. "Morgan Freeman, everyone!" Jimmy said, sitting back down at his desk. "Man, it is such an honor to have you here." "Thank you for having me, Jimmy," Morgan said in that unmistakable voice. Deep, warm, measured. The voice that could make a grocery list sound profound. The first 5 minutes went perfectly. They talked about Morgan's latest film, a thriller where he played a retired CIA analyst. Morgan told a funny story about filming in Prague. The audience laughed. Jimmy laughed. It was classic Tonight Show banter. "You've had such an incredible career," Jimmy said, glancing at his next card. "I mean, you've worked with everyone. Clint Eastwood, Tim Robbins, Jack Nicholson. Is there anyone you haven't worked with that you'd love to?" Morgan paused, tilting his head thoughtfully. "You know, at this point in my career, I'm less interested in who I work with and more interested in why. The story matters more than the names." "That's beautiful," Jimmy said genuinely. He looked down at his cards, found the next question. "Speaking of stories that matter, I read somewhere that you almost didn't become an actor. That you had a completely different path planned." Morgan's expression shifted slightly. Something in his eyes changed, just a flicker, but Jimmy noticed. "That's true," Morgan said carefully. "I was going to be a fighter pilot. Joined the Air Force when I was 18. What changed your mind?" Morgan was quiet for a moment. His hands, which had been relaxed on the armrests, tensed slightly. "I discovered I was more interested in pretending to be a hero than actually being one." The audience chuckled, assuming it was self-deprecating humor. But there was something in the way Morgan said it, a weight that suggested it wasn't entirely a joke. Jimmy sensed it too. He should have moved on to the next question. Should have kept things light. But something made him pause, look at Morgan with genuine curiosity. "Was there a specific moment when you knew? When you knew acting was what you were meant to do?" What Jimmy didn't know was that the answer to this question had been locked away for 47 years. Morgan's jaw tightened. He looked down at his hands. When he looked back up, his eyes had a distant quality, like he was seeing something far beyond the studio lights. "There was someone," Morgan said quietly. "A long time ago. She told me I had a gift for making people believe in things that weren't real. She said that was more valuable than I understood." "She sounds wise," Jimmy said, not yet realizing he was stepping into dangerous territory. "She was." Morgan's voice was barely above a whisper now. Her name was Diana. The studio was silent. The audience, sensing a shift in tone, had stopped their usual murmuring. The Roots band members looked at each other uncertainly. Something was happening, but no one knew what. Jimmy glanced down at his note cards. The next question his writers had prepared, researched carefully, meant to be a touching moment, sat there in blue ink. I understand you credit a teacher from your early days for encouraging you to pursue acting. Can you tell us about her? Jimmy had no idea who the teacher was. His researchers had found a brief mention in an old interview from the 1980s where Morgan had vaguely referenced someone who believed in me when I was young. They'd built a question around it, assuming it would lead to a nice story about inspiration and gratitude. Jimmy read the question. I understand you credit a teacher from your early days for encouraging you to pursue acting. Diana, right? Can you tell us about her? The effect was instantaneous. Morgan Freeman's entire body went rigid. His eyes, which had been focused on Jimmy, suddenly filled with tears. Not subtle moisture. Actual tears that began to slide down his cheeks. The audience gasped. Jimmy's smile vanished. Morgan? Jimmy said, his voice full of concern. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Morgan held up one hand. The gesture was gentle but clear. Stop talking. For 10 seconds, nobody moved. The cameras stayed locked on Morgan Freeman's face as he fought to compose himself. His jaw clenched. His breathing became deliberate, controlled. But the tears kept coming. And then, without saying a single word, Morgan Freeman stood up. He didn't look at Jimmy. Didn't acknowledge the audience. He simply rose from the guest chair, his movements slow and deliberate, and began walking toward the edge of the stage. Morgan, wait, Jimmy said, standing up from behind his desk. Please, But Morgan was already moving. He walked past the cameras, past the surprised stage crew, past the producers frantically talking into their headsets, and disappeared through the stage door that led backstage. The studio erupted into confused murmuring. Jimmy stood frozen behind his desk, note cards scattered, his face showing genuine distress. The Roots didn't know whether to play or stay silent. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or stay quiet. Backstage, producers were scrambling. Morgan Freeman had walked off The Tonight Show in the middle of a live taping, and nobody knew why. Go to commercial! Director Dave shouted into the control room headset. Now! The familiar jingle played. The Tonight Show logo appeared on screens across America. In the studio chaos. Jimmy immediately left his desk and headed backstage, pulling off his microphone. Where did he go? He asked the production assistant. Green room, I think, the PA said, looking terrified. Mr. Fallon, I don't know what happened. The question was cleared by research. They said it was safe. It's not your fault, Jimmy said, already moving down the hallway toward the green rooms. His heart was pounding. In 15 years of hosting, he never had a guest walk off. Never made someone cry. Never caused that kind of pain. He found Morgan in green room 2. The legendary actor was sitting on the couch, elbows on his knees, face in his hands. His shoulders were shaking slightly. Jimmy knocked softly on the open door. Morgan? Can I come in? Morgan didn't look up, but he nodded. Jimmy entered slowly, closing the door behind him. He sat down on the couch, leaving space between them, waiting. After a long moment, Morgan spoke, his voice rough. You couldn't have known. I'm so sorry, Jimmy said. My researchers, they found a reference in an old interview. They thought it would be a nice story. I had no idea. Diana Hartley, Morgan said, lifting his head. His eyes were red, but he'd stopped crying. She was my English teacher. Junior year of high school. Greenwood, Mississippi. 1959. Jimmy stayed quiet, sensing that Morgan needed to talk. I was 17 years old, Morgan continued. Angry at the world. Angry at Mississippi. Angry at being black in the South in 1959. I joined the Air Force the moment I graduated because I wanted out. I wanted to fly planes and never look back at that town." He paused, collecting himself. "But Diana Hartley saw something in me. She ran the school drama club, which was radical enough in 1959 Mississippi for a black school to even have a drama club. She cast me in a play. Some small production. I don't even remember what it was. But I remember her sitting in the front row during rehearsal, watching me, and afterward she pulled me aside." Morgan's voice broke slightly. He cleared his throat. She said, "Morgan, you have a gift. You make people believe in impossible things. Don't waste that flying planes. The world needs people who can make others believe." Jimmy felt tears forming in his own eyes. "I laughed at her," Morgan said bitterly. "I told her acting was for white people in Hollywood. That there was no future for someone like me on stage. She looked at me and said, 'Then you be the future, Morgan. You be the one who makes it possible.'" "She sounds incredible," Jimmy said softly. "She was killed 3 months later," Morgan said flatly. "Car accident. June 1960. She was 20 years old. Driving home from a community theater performance in Jackson. Drunk driver ran a red light. The room fell silent. I was already in basic training when I heard." Morgan continued. "I couldn't even go to her funeral. And I carried that guilt for years. I dismissed her, laughed at her dream for me, and then she was gone before I could tell her she was right. 47 years of silence. 47 years of carrying this story. Until tonight, when a name spoken on live television broke it open. I didn't start acting until I was 30, Morgan said. 15 years after she died. And every single role I've ever taken, every performance I've ever given, has been because of what she told me that day. She's the reason I do this. But I've never talked about her publicly. Never. Because..." He trailed off, struggling. "Because it still hurts," Jimmy finished gently. Morgan nodded. "She believed in me when nobody else did. When I didn't believe in myself. And I never got to thank her." They sat in silence for a moment. Through the door, they could hear the muffled sounds of the studio crew trying to figure out what to do. The commercial break was almost over. Jimmy made a decision. "Morgan," he said carefully, "I know this is painful. And if you want to leave, you absolutely can. No questions asked? We'll figure out the show. But..." He paused, choosing his words. "If you want to tell her story, tell America about Diana Hartley and what she meant to you. I think she'd want that." Morgan looked at Jimmy for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "But I need you to understand something," Morgan said. "I'm going to cry. I can't promise I won't. This isn't something I can perform my way through." "That's okay," Jimmy said. "You don't have to perform. Just be honest." They walked back to the stage together. The audience, which had been buzzing with worried conversation, fell silent when they saw Morgan return. Some people started to applaud, but others shushed them, sensing this wasn't a moment for applause. Morgan sat back down in the guest chair. Jimmy took his place behind the desk. The cameras came back on. America was watching. "We're back," Jimmy said to the camera, his voice steadier than he felt. "And I want to apologize. A few minutes ago, I asked my guest a question without fully understanding its significance. Morgan, I'm truly sorry." "You don't need to apologize, Jimmy," Morgan said. His voice was still rough, but he sat up straighter. "You asked about someone named Diana. And she deserves to be talked about." For the next 12 minutes, an eternity in television time, Morgan Freeman told America about Diana Hartley. About a young black English teacher in 1959 Mississippi who saw potential in an angry 17-year-old. About how she pushed him toward acting when the very idea seemed absurd. About how she died before he could prove her right. About how every role he'd ever played, every character he'd ever brought to life, was a promise kept to a woman who never got to see him succeed. The studio was silent except for Morgan's voice. Audience members were crying openly. Jimmy wiped his eyes multiple times. The Roots sat motionless, instruments untouched. When Morgan finished, Jimmy did something he'd never done before. He stood up, walked around his desk, and embraced Morgan Freeman. Not for the cameras. Not for the show. Just two people acknowledging pain that had been carried too long alone. The audience rose as one. Not applause yet. Just standing. Bearing witness. Morgan pulled back, managed a small smile. "Thank you for letting me tell her story. Thank you for coming back," Jimmy said. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it, because stories like Diana Hartley's deserve to be heard. After the show, Morgan asked the producers for something unusual. He wanted the full unedited footage, the walk-off, the return, everything. 6 months later, he donated it to the Smithsonian's African American History Museum with Diana Hartley's name attached. In Greenwood, Mississippi, there's now a performing arts scholarship in her name. Morgan funds it personally. Every year, one student who makes people believe in impossible things receives it. Diana Hartley never saw Morgan Freeman become a legend. But 47 years after her death, the whole world finally heard her name.